Great. So I think we're live and we can start. So good evening, everyone who's joined us, or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Helen Clarkson, the Chief Executive of the Climate Group. I'm with Tim Ashby, who's the Director of the Under2 Coalition Secretariat. Tim, let's start by talking about tomorrow, the General Assembly of the Under2, the role of states and regions. Kick us off, and then if people have questions for Tim, put them in the chat box, and we will take it from there.
Great, thanks, Helen. So thanks for having me on the Q&A this evening. So Under2 Coalition is the General Assembly tomorrow. It's the apex moment for the Under2 Coalition. In any year, it's the moment when we pull together all of our membership. We hear from our leaders, from our co-chairs, and we'll be announcing our new co-chairs tomorrow, who will be Gavin Newsom, the Governor of California, Governor Servien from Querétaro in Mexico, Premier Sikalala from KwaZulu-Natal, and Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. So that's our big kind of moment there where they launch into the world. So what is the Under2 Coalition? I imagine there'll be a few people on this Q&A who may not know what the Under2 Coalition is yet. So the Under2 Coalition was an initiative that was set up in 2015. It was an initiative that was deliberately focused on the states and regions of the world, bringing together around the world to take collective action on climate, focused in the run up to Paris around trying to achieve a successful outcome from the Paris Agreement, and since 2015 and the Paris Agreement to delivering the Paris Agreement at a subnational level. Over the last 5 years, we've really grown out. We now have 220 governments around the world, representing 1.3 billion people, 43% of the global economy. And we're actually rated as being the coalition, the International Climate Initiative, that has the biggest emissions reduction potential in the world. It's estimated 4.6 to 5 gigatons of CO2 per year. That's around 15% of the annual global emissions. So it's a big old thing, the Under2 Coalition.
Great. And are states and regions cutting emissions fast enough to meet the Paris Agreement? You mentioned that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one. I mean, the Under2 Coalition is the high ambition group for states and regions. And at least part of the challenge that we've had over the last few years is getting the role of states and regions really understood in the international system. Obviously, the international system's predicated on the work of the parties, the nation states. And for a good while, there's been a lot of understanding around what cities and local authorities can do. We're about trying to wake up that piece in between. And certainly within the Under2 Commission, we really are trying to drive that global leadership. We've got a commitment we want to see around states and regions halving emissions in the next 10 years, developing long-term pathways to net zero emissions with those sorts of interim targets, and creating and implementing the right policies for more resilient, sort of sustainable systems. So what we see in the Under2 Coalition, because we hold ourselves to account on an annual basis, is consistent progress in that direction. But of course, there are governments in the world. We know as a whole, the world needs to go further and faster. So there's still a lot more to be done at this level as at all other levels.
Yeah, and you talked there about Paris, and we've talked about Paris to Glasgow next year, the next big COP after Paris. We've got a question from Nemat. What's the message that states and regions should take to Glasgow next year?
Well, I think one of the really good things that I've enjoyed over the last couple of years has been working with the high-level champions, particularly the last two, Gonzalo Munoz from Chile and Nigel Topping from the UK government. And I think they've really understood and helped to bring the states and regions of the world into the international process. It's really well understood by the COP26 presidency in the UK government as well, that states and regions are a key kind of part of the non-state actor kind of piece. So I think one of the things that I've been really enjoying working on over the last, nearly a year now, actually, has been a campaign with the high-level champions called the Race to Zero. And that's a campaign that Gonzalo Munoz instigated with the support of the UN Secretary General this time last year. It was launched at the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Summit that took place last September, which is around trying to rally leadership and support from businesses and from regions, cities, investors to drive towards the net zero sort of goal. And it's really grown and taken off, and having sort of been initiated by the Secretary General, picked up by the Chilean presidency, and now taken forward by the UK presidency and their high-level champion, it really creates this massive alliance that's committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. So, that's a really, great thing that I see sort of building and growing over the course of the next year as we run up to Glasgow.
Thanks. And Oswaldo Lucon from Sao Paulo has also suggested some messages. I don't know if you can see those. So the UNFCCC to commission the IPCC in order to conduct a special report on regions and climate change, and the Under2 Coalition to have a clear idea about the role of offsets in the net zero targets. That's more of a statement than a question, but I don't know if you've got thoughts about that suggestion.
Yeah. Thank you, Osvaldo. It's nice to have you here. Some really important points there, and I really agree with that point that Osvaldo's making there around how to get the role of state and regional governments sort of recognised within that IPCC structure, and really think that's such a great idea. And we've been talking about that recently, and we need to come up with some good tactics to actually make that land. And he's absolutely right around the role of offsets. I mean, what in trying to simplify what is net zero, and how does it differ from the Under2 Coalition? One of the things I sort of say is essentially, if we're committed to 80 to 95% reduction by mid-century, the key difference that really you're looking at around net zero is what you do in the negative emissions, so carbon capture and storage, offsets, reforestation, so on. And clearly the kind of controversial and difficult part in there is offsets.
Yeah, just on a different tack, question from Jacob Corvidite, who says, Tim, you mentioned you're seeing consistent progress, but that we have to go further, faster. How much do you hear city, state and regional leaders actually putting the idea of the climate decade front and centre? Are they facing pushback or support from citizens? And I think that's such a critical question at the moment.
Yeah. I don't want to universalise, so I'll try and stick to a couple of anecdotes. And, I think we are seeing there's a number of states in the US that have signed up to the net zero campaign, and that really big sort of ratcheting of ambition. And we're certainly seeing that from the likes of Nevada and California, Hawaii. There are some really kind of frontline leading kind of states. Some really interesting work going on in places like South Australia that have taken on. So it's a Liberal government in South Australia. They took over from a Labour government. There was a bit of a thought that they may not adhere to the previous incumbents' climate ambitions. But actually, they've really made climate part of their mandate. They've done a lot of the economic modelling in order to be able to look at what they need to do to set an interim target through to 2030. And it was a very deliberate piece of work, looking at what does that 10-year kind of horizon look like. And our co-chair from Scotland did exactly the same thing, where they were looking at very specifically at that interim target. And I think that's the interesting bit around the race to zero, is around the extent to which, taking the Paris idea about mid-century kind of ambitions and pathways, but actually bringing that bit back. And we've obviously been talking about it a lot at the climate group over the last year plus, as being one of our key comms messages, that it's this decade that really matters. I wouldn't want to universalize around the sort of widespread electoral popularity of it, but I absolutely see that works very well in Scotland, and it's been a bipartisan issue, not in all Australians, but in some.
I think just building on that a little bit, the impact of sort of Fridays for the Future on how all the politicians we deal with at different levels think about citizens, and then looking at some of the polling coming out of COVID, I think it's going to be interesting to watch. By that polling, I mean people saying we want something different, we don't want to go back to how things were. It's going to be interesting to see whether that does now start to translate into elections at all the different levels, and how much that's a conversation tomorrow at the General Assembly. I'd be interested to see.
Yeah.
So Mutahara Deva, apologies if I've really mangled the pronunciation of your name, Mutahara. Tim, what action are you taking to make Under2 Coalition much more visible in developing countries? Result-orientated action can be initiated. I'm of the opinion that pilot projects can be taken up.
Yeah.
That's her comment question. So how do we make it more visible in developing countries?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and one that's really close to my heart. I think one of the really interesting things that we've been doing, I think really since 2017, is taking a look at ourselves. One of the things that when the Under2 Coalition was originally set up, it was primarily mitigation focused. It was industrialized countries, or the most industrialized parts of developing countries. And we've made a deliberate plan to sort of look at doing things differently, but globalizing the role of the Under2 Coalition, and to build out our work in India, China, Africa. Probably our most successful area of work, and Osvaldo previously is part of it, is our work in Latin America. And the Under2 Coalition in those middle income countries, Latin America, has grown very rapidly, and it's our biggest caucus of members now is the Latin American membership. So it's a really vibrant kind of area. And as you say, it's there. It has to be around practical assistance and support. So the sorts of work that we're doing has been around how to, I mentioned earlier on about holding to account. So we do big capacity building project with developing country states in India and South Africa, in Brazil, and Mexico, which is looking at how do you build the inventory, how do you build the basis for your emissions reduction. So how do you actually put together your kind of emissions profiles and report on them, and then in a parallel project that we're running, then look at the question of what do you need to do in order to build out a pathway through to 2050 in order to reduce your emissions. Now, what we're trying to do from that, those are two specific projects, is that and try and expand those projects out and make them a much more sort of wide-ranging kind of project. We're not there yet, but at the moment we're really sort of doing a lot more work on two pieces of work. One's called Tracking to Action, and another called Pathway Pioneers, where we've got peer forums, and we've now got about 50 of the members who are regularly participating in webinars that we're doing, looking at those particular topics. So absolutely agree with the premise of the question there, Mutahara.
Great. And we've got a question from Frederick, which I'm sort of mulling on, which is a toll on imported products from countries with low greenhouse gas ambitions, not aligned to science-based targets, a good way of driving change by countries with high greenhouse gas ambition in place? And I don't know if we can come to that from a state and regional angle, but it's an interesting question about how we use cross-border incentives. I don't know if you've got something that's come up on that.
Yeah, I know enough about the question, Frederick, in order to say that I couldn't necessarily answer it very well for you. And obviously, it's one of the issues that's kind of going on at the moment with regard to the EU and the US. I'm not quite sure how it kind of rolls down to a subnational level as well. But it's a good question. I'll definitely take it away.
Yeah. And then Mutahara Devek has come back again. In my part of the world, in Kashmir, we lack real-time data on few key indicators of climate change. Here, climate change will impact the entire Himalayan region. We have rice cultivation, and methane is a problem here, or methane for our US colleagues. Do you want to say a little bit about our methane project, Tim, and some of the work we've done? Yeah, I know it's a different area, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? This short-lived climate pollutants is an area of work that we've focused on in the last couple of years because of the forcing effects of methane and the other short-lived climate pollutants, and they're short-lived. So if you can get rid of them quickly, then you can have a greater return on your work. Thus far, our work has actually focused on the oil and gas sector and emissions from those. So it's tended to take place more in developed countries, North America in particular. So that's been the work on that so far. But absolutely, that question there around the real-time data, the availability of weather stations. So I used to live in Kenya, and for many years, and I think the whole of Kenya is covered by something like 9 meteorological sites, and which was a very tiny amount, a very large country with huge geographical discrepancy. So the availability of data was really hard to come by. There's actually some really cool work around real-time indicators of certainly meteorological variability, but you can put the data sets together over a really long period of time by using mobile telephony, because the biggest kind of impedance to mobile comms is actually rain, clouds, and atmospheric conditions. So you've got a direct proxy indicator. I know the African Development Bank is doing some really interesting work with the global GSMA, Global Satellite and Mobile Association, something like that, which is actually looking at different ways in which you can try and crack the data nut. At the moment, a lot of it is kind of real-time reporting of, not real-time, you don't get real-time reporting, it's retrospective reporting, it's arduous, it's data entry, and it's one of the areas that my head of transparency is really interested in looking at.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you were talking, I could see it said Jacob is Cordovai is typing. I was like, Jacob's going to say something useful on this. So he's included a link in the chat box. Jacob's from RMI and got a link in the chat box for some of the work that they've done on AI and satellites. Actually, I was going to say, I'm judging an awards at the moment. I'm seeing a lot around AI, satellites, and a lot of these technologies, which probably seemed kind of quite sci-fi a few years ago, are really coming down in price. And I know there's quite a lot of efforts now to think about how we use and roll out some of those things to the developing world. I've got one last question, which I'm going to ask, and then we, as a sort of lead into tomorrow. So do any states and regions stand out to you as really strong on climate action right now? I know we've seen a lot from across Under2, but why don't you give a shout out to some of the great action we've seen, and then tell us a bit about tomorrow's General Assembly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really enjoying the work that we're doing with some of our Latin American members. I'd really give a shout out to Querétaro in Mexico. They've been doing some fantastic work around setting their long-term pathways, and their governors really lent in on that. I think we've seen from Pernambuco some really exciting stuff around how they're coming reasonably recently to the climate kind of challenge, but learning very fast and moving quickly. Governor Doria from Sao Paulo, really interesting leadership that he's providing there. Difficult context there, but actually showing that at the state level you can get some really interesting action kind of going on. It's not just those countries where it's an established sort of narrative. We're also seeing states like KwaZulu-Natal coming in really quickly and responding to the climate challenge, along with the humanitarian challenge that's being driven out of that and by the COVID sort of challenge that they're experiencing. I mean, obviously, I would look back to our sort of founders in Baden-Württemberg, who've always been a very strong kind of supporter of us, and of course California, continuing to see really exciting developments coming out of California across a range of different targets around renewable energy, and potentially some new stuff coming out tonight around the vehicle transportation sector.
Great, thank you. And Nema adds, it goes to show how important the work on AFOLU emissions is, and we'll hear from Mato Grosso on that at the General Assembly tomorrow. So with that, I think we're at the end of our allotted time. I know we could talk about this topic for a lot longer. I understand that's the last thing on this platform tonight. Obviously, Climate Week as a whole has about 400 events registered, so there's still plenty going on, which you can see on the Climate Week NYC website. And we also understand that on their Twitter feed, Government of California will be announcing some new stuff in about 5 minutes, which one would hope will be suitably ambitious, as we know California are. So I think that's going on the Government of California YouTube, and then the events start here on this platform again in the morning, pretty early, I understand, if you're in the US tomorrow. Thanks, Tim.
Great. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.